The gavel cracks once, sharp as lightning splitting the silence. Every head in the courtroom jerks toward the bench. Judge Aileen Cannon's eyes flash like polished steel. "Order," she barks, her voice echoing off marble walls. But the command comes too late. The words Jasmine Crockett just delivered hang in the air, heavy, defiant, undeniable.
For a moment, no one moves.
Reporters freeze mid-keystroke.
A bailiff's jaw tightens.
Somewhere in the gallery, a camera clicks, then another, and another, as if instinct itself can't resist capturing this impossible instant. Jasmine stands at the lectern, shoulders squared, expression calm but alive with something deeper, conviction. It's the composure of someone who's spent a lifetime being told to wait her turn, only to realize this is her turn. The light catches her eyes, and she doesn't flinch.
Judge Cannon leans forward.
"Miss Crockett, you will withdraw that statement." Jasmine's reply is almost a whisper, but it carries like thunder.
"No, Your Honor."
The record deserves honesty. A rustle spreads through the room. Shock, admiration, disbelief. Even the court stenographer pauses, fingers hovering above the keys. Viewers watching the live feed feel that pulse, that electrical jolt of something real breaking through the ceremony of power. On social media, the live stream count spikes.
Comment threads ignite.
Everyone is typing their own version of the same thought. Did she just say that to a federal judge? The judge's expression curdles. Authority, once absolute, trembles around the edges. "You are out of line," she says. But her voice doesn't ring as loudly as before. Jasmine's stillness speaks louder than any outburst could.
Cameras flash again.
Somewhere, a door creaks open. The air itself seems to shift. The courtroom has become a stage, and America is watching a new kind of civic theater unfold. One where poise is the weapon, truth the script, and courage the lighting that refuses to dim. Every face leans closer, searching for the next move. Cannon's gavel twitches in her hand. Jasmine doesn't blink. And then, as the echo of pride and defiance ripples through every corner of the nation, the narrator's voice breaks the tension. But when the judge tried to strike her words from the record, the moment took a turn no one could have predicted. Hours before the gavel ever struck, the air in the courthouse felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Reporters lined the marble steps outside, shoulder to shoulder beneath the Texas sun. Protesters waved signs that read "Justice means all of us, and we see you, Jasmine." Chants drifted through the entranceway like a heartbeat, steady, rising, impossible to ignore. Inside, every inch of the courtroom pulsed with anticipation. The bailiffs whispered to each other. Even the flag behind the bench seemed to stand taller than usual, aware this wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. This was theater and trial, democracy colliding with ego. Cameras were set to stream live to millions. Judge Aileen Cannon's reputation had walked through the door long before she had. To her supporters, she was the uncompromising guardian of tradition. To her critics, she was the face of a system allergic to accountability, a woman who valued control above fairness. Each decision she made had been dissected on cable panels and talk shows, painted as evidence of quiet bias dressed up in procedure. Then came Representative Jasmine Crockett, a name already electric among progressives. A lawyer by training, she'd carved a reputation for speaking truth with surgical precision and refusing to dilute her words for anyone's comfort. When she walked into Cannon's courtroom, the symbolism was unmistakable, the voice of the new America stepping into the domain of the old one. Pundits had billed it as a clash between decorum and defiance. Can Crockett reign in her fire? One headline teased. Another countered, can Cannon stay impartial under pressure? Viewers tuned in not just for answers, but for confrontation. Jasmine, though, wasn't chasing spectacle. She carried folders lined with the kind of meticulous evidence that makes bullies blink. Her team had spent weeks preparing for every rhetorical trap and procedural roadblock. What she sought wasn't victory, it was exposure. She wanted the American people to see the imbalance she'd fought her entire career to correct. Cannon, meanwhile, prepared to remind everyone who ruled the room. Her hands rested on the bench like a queen guarding a throne. To her, authority wasn't simply earned, it was bestowed, inherited through the institution she embodied. Her every gesture said, "This is my house." As the crowd settled, the first exchange between them crackled. Cannon interrupted mid-sentence, her tone curt. Jasmine paused, smiled faintly, then finished her statement as though the interruption hadn't occurred. Gasps fluttered across the benches. The moment was microscopic yet monumental, two realities brushing together like live wires. Outside, the chants grew louder. Inside, the lights felt brighter. Social media feeds buzzed with side-by-side images, Cannon's tight, disciplined scowl and Jasmine's serene defiance. The caption beneath most posts said what millions were already thinking: this isn't about evidence anymore, it's about everything else. Political commentators scrambled to take positions. Some framed it as a simple hearing gone viral, others, as the rebirth of accountability on national television. News tickers rolled, hashtags surged, and comment sections turned into battlefields of ideology. Every second in that courtroom now carried the weight of decades: gender, race, power, institutional faith. It was the kind of slow-motion collision America couldn't look away from, because in Jasmine's voice, people heard themselves being defended. As the hearing reached its peak of tension, Judge Cannon adjusted her glasses and prepared to assert control again. She wasn't ready to be challenged. Jasmine, calm as the center of a hurricane, readied herself to test the limits. Everyone thought they knew how this hearing would go, until a single exchange flipped the entire power dynamic live on camera. Before the cameras, before the viral hashtags, Aileen Cannon cultivated the kind of reputation that only thrives behind closed courthouse doors, a reputation built on control. She spoke little but ruled decisively, her written opinions stitched with enough legal embroidery to impress her allies and confound her critics. To the establishment, she was dutiful, disciplined, a torchbearer of tradition. To her detractors, she was the embodiment of the system's aloofness, a judge more interested in preserving authority than pursuing truth. Her rise began quietly, in law libraries and clerkships, each step guided by an unswerving conviction that order, her definition of it, must be maintained at all costs. Mentors called her meticulous, ambitious. Peers called her unbending. She took the bench younger than most, with a smile faint as frost and a certainty that warmed no one. The first signs of controversy came like cracks in glass, small, deniable, but spreading fast. A ruling dismissed on appeal, a lenient interpretation that favored the powerful, a closed-door meeting that journalists could only speculate about. On talk shows, her name became shorthand for judicial unpredictability. She wasn't corrupt, they said, she was conflicted. A judge who believed neutrality meant silence when fairness demanded voice. Still, Cannon never flinched. She learned to wield restraint as weaponry. Her pauses in court grew legendary, each one long enough to make lawyers shift in their seats, replaying every syllable they'd spoken, terrified of the verdict forming behind her expressionless stare. When she finally spoke, her words landed with the precision of a blade. Short sentences, long consequences. She interrupted often, her questions more performances than inquiries. Clarify, she'd say, though it usually meant, justify yourself, to me. Headlines multiplied. The most polarizing judge in America. Lady Justice or Lady Favor. But in Cannon's chambers, none of that penetrated. The world might chatter, but she had her method, her decorum, her script. That's what authority meant, imperviousness. And behind the bench, she clung to that illusion like armor. Every ruling, from minor procedural squabbles to nationally watched political cases, became an act of reinforcement. To challenge her was to threaten not just her authority but her understanding of who she was. The courtroom was her domain, her kingdom of ordered chaos. What the public rarely saw was her obsession with control's fragility. She knew that attention could erode power faster than scandal. Cameras were both mirror and magnifier. So when this new hearing brought her to the national spotlight again, she reminded her clerks, in that clipped tone that allowed no dissent, we maintain decorum. On paper, the day should have been routine, a procedural hearing, manageable, containable. But the moment she saw Jasmine Crockett's name on the docket, something in her tightened. Crockett had become a headline herself. Sharp, eloquent, impossible to box in. Cannon sensed the tone, the scrutiny waiting outside, an audience hungry for confrontation. Still, she told herself, a courtroom is not a stage. And yet, as she entered that morning, every camera lens felt fixed on her robe like crosshairs. The chant from the crowd outside bled faintly through the stone walls. She adjusted her collar, forced composure, and pretended not to hear. People rose when she took her seat, the ritual of standing feeding her certainty. She glanced briefly at Jasmine across the courtroom, a quick scan, assessing posture, eyes, confidence. Her conclusion was instant: this one needs reminding who commands this space. So she struck first, cutting off introductions, enforcing technicalities with theatrical poise. It was a chess game of tone, not substance, and for a while, she felt the satisfaction of absolute control returning. But something shifted, subtle at first. Jasmine didn't react as expected. No anxious fidgeting, no tightened throat. Just focus, measured, unmoved. Cannon's questions, usually sharp enough to unravel any witness, slid off Jasmine like rain on glass. The silence between them grew charged, the kind of silence that exposes which side is uncertain. Cannon's confidence began to calcify into irritation. Her voice rose half a note, rare for her. Observers noticed. Cameras caught the flicker in her expression, the faint, almost imperceptible wince of realization that the narrative was slipping away from her control. The courtroom, once her fortress, now mirrored her unease. The same marble walls that had amplified her authority seemed to echo her frustration instead. A momentary tremor at the edges of her dignity, a human falter, broadcast live. Outside, pundits sensed it. Inside, Jasmine remained the eye of the storm, still, analytical, unthreatened. For once, Cannon found herself looking across the bench and seeing not an adversary to silence, but a force she could no longer predict. Power, she realized too late, isn't a robe. It's the ability to convince others you deserve one. And that's when the story turned. The woman who had built her career on command found herself facing someone who refused to be commanded. But standing before her today wasn't a nervous attorney. It was someone who had made a career out of standing up to power itself. Long before the marble columns and the camera lenses, Jasmine Crockett learned how to keep her voice steady when the world tried to shake it. She grew up in a neighborhood where every victory, no matter how small, was earned twice, once through effort, then again through resilience. Her mother worked late at the hospital, her father drove night shifts. At their kitchen table, Jasmine listened to stories about the dignity of labor, the sting of unfairness, and the quiet heroism of those who refused to fold. When teachers told her she was too outspoken, she smiled and spoke louder the next time. Her report cards became a collection of contradictions, brilliant, argumentative, unafraid to question instructions. That tension, the refusal to quiet herself, became her first act of resistance. Law school was the natural next chapter, but it was anything but easy. She was often the only black woman in the lecture hall and sometimes the only one speaking when classmates stumbled over topics they'd never lived through. At night she'd stay in the library until the cleaning crew turned off the lights, her notes flecked with coffee stains and determination. She studied not just to pass exams, but to translate her community's reality into the precise language of power, the kind written on legal documents and spoken in courtrooms. After graduation, she could have chosen the comfortable route: corporate law, quiet paychecks, safety behind glass towers. Instead, she opened a small defense practice in a cramped office that smelled faintly of old paper and injustice. She represented the forgotten and the falsely accused, teenagers tagged as criminals before they could vote, families threatened by landlords hiding behind loopholes, immigrants too scared to trust the system that constantly betrayed them. Her clients couldn't afford polished attorneys, but they left her office with something far more valuable: an advocate who saw them completely. She won some cases, lost others, but every battle sharpened her understanding of strength. It wasn't about aggression, it was about clarity. Then came her transition into politics, not out of ambition, but exhaustion. She realized the courtroom could fix symptoms, but only legislation could address the disease. When she stepped onto the campaign trail, she didn't talk about abstract policies. She talked about humanity, housing, women's rights, schooling, the kind of fairness that shouldn't need defending. Her speeches were fire wrapped in thoughtfulness. Crowds gathered not because she promised miracles, but because she spoke like one of them, yet refused to lower her standards for anyone. Cameras eventually found her. Networks began describing her as outspoken, incendiary, fearless. She wore each word like a badge. Journalists who expected temper found precision, those expecting softness found steel. She became emblematic of a generation that believed intelligence could be both weapon and shield, and that anger, when refined by principle, could be a form of love. There was a night, long before this hearing, when Jasmine nearly quit. A client she'd fought for lost his case, justice swallowed whole by bureaucracy. She sat alone in her car, staring at the courthouse steps she'd walked 100 times. For the first time, she wondered if the system was designed to break people like her. But then her phone buzzed, a voicemail from the client's mother, her voice trembling but grateful.
"You fought for him," she said.
"That's more than anyone else ever did." That single message became Jasmine's anchor. From that night forward, she decided that no intimidation, by courtroom, camera, or colleague, would mute the truth she carried. As a legislator, she brought that same ferocity to hearings and press conferences. Her questions were traps for the dishonest, bridges for the sincere. While others rehearsed platitudes, she spoke from scars. And people listened, not because she shouted, but because every word carried the gravity of lived experience. Her path was marked with friction: social media storms, political attacks, dismissive headlines. Each attempt to discredit her only refined her purpose. She learned to modulate outrage into persuasion, to shape rage into elegance. When others resorted to platitudes, she reached for principle. Small victories piled up, bills sponsored, communities protected, debates won by simply outthinking those who underestimated her. Through it all, she never abandoned empathy. It became her signature, a paradox of strength through softness. To her, justice was never theoretical, it was personal. And that's what made this particular hearing so charged. Facing Judge Cannon wasn't just another professional assignment, it was symbolic, almost poetic. The girl once told she talked too much, was now standing in the sacred chamber of a woman who silenced others for a living. The young lawyer who once slept under fluorescent lights to prepare closing arguments now stood illuminated under broadcast lighting, every microexpression recorded, every pause analyzed. Yet she didn't quiver. She breathed, took measure of the room, and carried with her the ghosts of every client she defended, every insult she'd endured, every small injustice she'd fought to correct. In that moment, her courage wasn't loud, it was composed. The stillness that unsettled Cannon was the same calm that carried her through every storm before. The very traits that critics once mocked, her assertiveness, her empathy, her refusal to defer, had become her armor. She understood that authority is not inherent to position, it's earned through authenticity. And authenticity, she thought, is the one thing power can't counterfeit. Now, as the cameras whir and America watches, Jasmine Crockett doesn't see herself merely as one woman in a courtroom. She sees every teacher who silenced a curious girl, every employer who dismissed intelligence because it sounded too passionate, every citizen who learned to measure anger so it might finally be heard. She has faced down condescension, bureaucracy, and inequality, and each time, she learned to transform insult into endurance. But here, before this judge, under this spotlight, the stakes are transformed again. Because this time, the question isn't whether Jasmine's words will be heard. It's whether power itself can stand the sound of a woman speaking truth without permission. She had faced down bullies before, but never one wielding both the gavel and the cameras of the nation. The courtroom hums like a live wire. You can almost hear the air tightening, the collective intake of breath before words crash into each other. Reporters crouch forward, fingers poised over keyboards, the percussive tap-tap of typing becoming its own nervous heartbeat. Every sound slices through the hush, heels clicking, paper shifting, the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Jasmine Crockett adjusts a single page on the lectern, her hand steady, voice even. "Your Honor, the matter before us." "Counselor," Judge Cannon interrupts, voice clipped. "You're straying." A ripple of discomfort passes through the gallery, even the ceiling fans seem to hesitate. Jasmine doesn't flinch. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm establishing relevance." "You will answer my question," Cannon says. There's an uncomfortable chuckle from the backbench, quickly silenced by the bailiff's glare. The court reporter's keys stutter and then resume, each stroke recording history in real time. Jasmine exhales slowly, as if releasing the room's tension through her lungs. "If the question is about relevance," she says, calm as glass, "then the relevance is truth itself." Cannon straightens. "This court decides what's relevant." "It decides what's admissible," Jasmine replies. "Truth doesn't require permission." A murmur, short, sharp, electric, ripples through the spectators. Someone whispers, "She really said that?" Another, "She's done." The judge's gavel comes down once. "Ms. Crockett." This is not a stage for speeches. Across the front row, a handful of law clerks shift uneasily, they know that tone. It's the one Judge Cannon uses right before an attorney loses the goodwill of the bench. Yet Jasmine's shoulders stay relaxed. No protest, no defensive twitch, just that steady gaze fixed on the gavel as if daring it to strike again. When she resumes, her words are rhythm, deliberate and grounded. "I respect the court," she begins, "but respect cannot mean silence." It's not anger that fills her voice, it's reason sharpened by purpose. The contrast cuts through the courtroom like light through smoke. You can feel the metaphors writing themselves in journalists' minds even before their pens catch up. Cannon leans forward. "Ms. Crockett, you are testing the limits of my patience." "With all due respect," Jasmine says, "I'm testing the limits of fairness." The pause that follows is long enough to make the camera crews shift focus. A bead of sweat drips down one of the reporter's temples. The stenographer's hands tremble just slightly. Cannon's lips thin into the suggestion of a smile, the kind that hides irritation behind authority. "You seem to forget who runs this courtroom." Jasmine tilts her head. "No, Your Honor. I remember exactly who does. I'm just reminding everyone watching that no one should run from accountability." That does it. The audience gasps audibly this time, the sound too human to mute. A bailiff glances nervously toward the bench, another toward the cameras. It feels as though time splits into two tempos, Cannon's rigid control and Jasmine's quiet rebellion, colliding measure by measure. Cannon presses her hands flat on the bench. "Withdraw that remark or face contempt." Jasmine hesitates, just long enough for tension to become spectacle. "Withdraw truth?" she asks. You can strike it from the record, Your Honor. But not from the people listening. The line lands like a thunderclap. The air itself reacts, shocking, vibrant, alive. Phones light up with breaking alerts. A young reporter bites her lip to suppress an audible "Oh my God."
For the first time all morning, Cannon looks uncertain.
She glances down at her notes, then up again, voice searching for the authority she's always commanded by instinct. This proceeding will return to order, she declares, but the statement sounds like a plea dressed as command. The bailiff taps his baton once against the floor. The echo wanders in vain for obedience that never truly returns. Jasmine doesn't gloat, she simply waits unhurried, as though control itself is conceding ground one silent inch at a time. Every movement carries power, the shift of her shoulders, the calm curve of her hand on the lectern, the measured breath before she speaks again. Somewhere in that stillness lies her advantage. She doesn't need to win the moment, she merely needs to outlast it. This is no longer a legal argument, it's a moral collision. Around the country, televisions drone in break rooms, diners, classrooms. Viewers lean closer, sensing that something irreversible is happening. The archetypes have become clear, authority clinging to ritual, justice cloaked in calm defiance. Cannon senses it too. Her next words sound more defensive than directive. You will conduct yourself properly, or I will suspend these proceedings. Jasmine's gaze doesn't waver.
Then suspend them.
Truth can wait, but it will not disappear.
Gasps again.
A collective realization, the careful balance of fear and submission that once defined Cannon's courtroom no longer exists. And then, right when it seemed the judge had cornered her, Jasmine leaned in, smiled, and delivered a single line that changed everything.
The room holds its breath.
Jasmine doesn't. She adjusts the microphone with a small, deliberate motion, the kind that says she's done being managed. Her voice, when it comes, is measured, so quiet that everyone must lean in to catch it. Your Honor, she begins, I entered this courtroom to talk about evidence, not ego. The hush is fractal. Even the fluorescent lights seem to dim, yielding to the gravity of her tone. Cannon opens her mouth to respond, but Jasmine goes on, unhurried, unbothered. The reason people tune into hearings like this is because they want to believe the system still listens to them. They want to trust the robe, trust the gavel, trust the word justice. But every time truth is dismissed for comfort, that trust dies a little more. A reporter's pen stops mid-sentence. One man in the back, an older attorney with decades of courtroom fatigue etched into his face, whispers, she's saying what we've all wanted to say. Cannon raps the gavel once. Miss Crockett, you will confine yourself
to honesty.
Jasmine's eyebrow lifts. Her tone sharpens, rhythm quickening like a heartbeat gaining confidence. Respectfully, that's what I'm doing. Because honesty doesn't bend when authority gets uncomfortable. Cannon inhales sharply, ready to interrupt again, but something in the audience shifts, the soft murmur of people recognizing conviction as it's born. Jasmine continues, words flowing like steady percussion. When we say law and order, we should mean fairness, not control. We should mean equal accountability, not selective silence. Because a system that fears questions isn't a system, it's a stage play written for the powerful. Gasps ripple. Someone drops their phone, it clatters against tile like punctuation.
Cannon lifts her chin.
You're grandstanding, representative. This is not Congress. No, Jasmine replies, voice still low but now pulsing with purpose.
This is bigger.
This is where people see what happens when courage meets power in real time. And I intend to make sure they see, with clarity. The crowd leans closer. Drops of tension bead on the judge's brow, imperceptible to most but obvious to the cameras now zoomed close. The lighting finds every contour, every twitch, authority's armor beginning to rust under scrutiny.
Let me be clear, Jasmine says.
I believe in the rule of law.
I've built my life on it.
But the rule of law means accountability up and down the chain. Not just for the powerless, not just for the ones without microphones, but for those who wield the rules as shields. This time, Cannon doesn't interject. The silence between each phrase becomes applause in waiting. The robe you wear, Jasmine says softly, was meant to symbolize impartiality. But justice can't just look neutral, it has to act it. And every time the robe silences fairness, it stains itself. The audience's gasps merge into a quiet, involuntary wow. Even the bailiff stands straighter, unsure whether to intervene or to listen. Cannon's fingers tighten around the gavel until her knuckles pale. You are dangerously close to contempt. Jasmine's eyes meet hers, unwavering.
Contempt for who? For truth? For conscience?
If telling the truth in this room qualifies as contempt, then that says more about the room than about me. Every camera light flares. Every journalist subconsciously sits taller. There's no raising a voice, no theatrics. Just unassailable calm. The contrast is devastating. The woman without the bench now commands all of it, while the woman with the bench clings to silence as defense. Jasmine lets the quiet stretch a beat longer, then delivers the next blow like a confession. Your Honor, I've spent my life looking into the eyes of people who had no one willing to speak for them. I've watched verdicts fall on the wrong shoulders. I've watched respect weaponized to keep people quiet. But respect and silence are not the same thing. And power isn't supposed to teach fear, it's supposed to teach fairness. A murmur of agreement rises before anyone can restrain it. The bailiff looks toward the judge for instruction. Cannon gives none. Now Jasmine's rhythm shifts, slow again, nearly tender. The irony, she says, is that I came here expecting a legal fight. But what I walked into is a mirror of America itself, a place where one side clings to control while the other insists on dignity. My loyalty isn't to pride or protocol. It's to the people who sent me here believing that their stories matter. Her words hang there, shimmering with the weight of exhausted hope.
Cannon swallows.
This court is not a forum for
truth.
Jasmine cuts in again, with the soft insistence of inevitability.
Truth fits everywhere, Your Honor.
You just have to leave the door open. A young clerk at the side table bites his lip to hide a smile. The camera pans across the audience, faces wide-eyed, spellbound. Jasmine steps forward 1/2 inch. Her tone turns conversational, intimate, as if addressing the millions beyond the walls. We keep calling these proceedings trials. But the real trial is faith, the public's faith that justice still exists in practice, not just on parchment. And every time someone tries to smother that faith with authority, we make the same mistake. We forget that courage is contagious. The statement hits like a gust of oxygen. Outside in the hallway, a junior reporter texts her editor. She flipped it. The judge's losing the room. Inside, Cannon sits motionless. You can almost see the calculation behind her eyes, how to recover, how to reclaim ground. But every second she hesitates, Jasmine's composure becomes gravity itself, pulling attention away from the bench. Jasmine's final push is both scalpel and sermon. You can gavel down words, Your Honor. You can strike them from records, redact transcripts, mute microphones. But you can't edit what people feel when they recognize justice in human form. That's why they're watching. That's why they'll remember this. She pauses, lets stillness bloom again, and then adds, almost whispering, power lasts only as long as people believe in it. Truth outlives belief. Cannon blinks, once, twice, her expression tightening around disbelief.
For the first time, she doesn't respond.
A journalist drops her pen altogether. Its clang echoes across the room, strangely perfect. Someone in the back exhales loudly, as though freed from holding breath for too long. Jasmine offers a respectful nod to the judge, turns a page on her notes she'll no longer need, and adds one last, crystalline sentence. I'm finished, Your Honor. No theatrics.
No smile.
Just radiance through restraint. The gavel falls but cannot reclaim control. Not one person looks away from Jasmine as it echoes. The country watching through screens feels it too, that strange, liberating vibration when injustice is finally called by its name. And while the courtroom tried to regain its breath, the outside world was already exploding. The sound of the gavel hadn't even faded before the real storm began. Outside the courthouse, phones lifted like a field of candles, recording, refreshing, reckoning. Within minutes, social media timelines filled with the clip, Jasmine Crockett's calm defiance under the relentless gaze of authority. The caption wrote itself before anyone could type it, #CrockettClapback. The video flooded Twitter, TikTok, Instagram Reels, every platform that could translate courage into pixels. 17 seconds was all it took for the world to choose sides. Tens of thousands of comments appeared in waves, the same stunned reaction repeating again and again. She didn't raise her voice.
She didn't flinch.
News alerts followed, torn between admiration and outrage. One outlet's headline read, Crockett dresses down federal power with surgical precision. Another countered with a strained defense, Judge Cannon faces political theater in courtroom uproar. The narrative war was on, and it was spreading faster than any legal argument ever could. Cable panels lit up the night sky. On one side of a split screen, a conservative pundit insisted Jasmine's words were grandstanding. On the other, a civil rights attorney smiled faintly before replying, grandstanding isn't when you tell the truth. It's when you fear it. The clip earned 500,000 likes before the commercial break. Late-night hosts turned the exchange into cultural folklore. One reenacted the moment frame by frame, ending with applause and mock gavel thuds. But amid the satire, a deeper tone emerged: admiration, relief, even gratitude. "You ever see someone say the thing everyone else was too scared to say?" one host asked. "That's what courage looks like in real time." Outside the screens, the ripple hit the streets. Activists seized her words like a rallying cry, painting signs that read "Truth doesn't need permission," and marching through city centers. Students replayed her closing line in clips for debate clubs, studying her poise as if it were choreography. Community organizers quoted her in press releases. The moment had escaped the boundaries of the courthouse. It had become part of the American lexicon of resistance. In congressional halls, colleagues referenced the Crockett principle: courage without chaos. One senator tweeted, "Composure is the new revolution." The post was shared across continents. Even international newspapers picked up the footage under headlines like "American Poise Goes Viral." In Nairobi, a young journalist called it defiance turned art. In Seoul, a women's rights group edited the clip into a motivational short titled "Stand Straight." Of course, backlash arrived too: accusations of disrespect, editorials warning about decorum decay. One op-ed fumed that Jasmine Crockett has mistaken the courtroom for a campaign stage. Yet the outrage rang hollow. The footage itself contradicted every talking point: the stillness, the measured voice, the way the judge seemed smaller not through insult but through comparison. Memes sprouted overnight. Jasmine's quiet smile became an emblem of modern courage, captioned with lines like "Grace louder than gavel" and "Stay calm, speak truth." Each post added to a sense that something shifted, not merely politically, but spiritually. Comment sections that usually devolved into digital shouting turned, for once, reflective. "She didn't attack," one viewer wrote. "She simply stood there until truth embarrassed arrogance." Another replied, "That's what leadership looks like in heels." Politicians, activists, teachers, all found their own stake in her composure. One civics teacher captured his classroom watching the footage. Half the students mouthed Jasmine's words with her, as though reciting poetry. The clip crossed algorithms, bridging age groups, regions, backgrounds. Across an evening news montage, the spectacle looked almost cinematic. Split screens showed Cannon disappearing behind tinted car windows while, blocks away, Jasmine stepped out into flashes and shouts. She didn't wave. She just nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement to the crowd chanting her name. Commentators marveled at her restraint even then. One anchor summarized it perfectly: "She plays a long game. In a world addicted to noise, silence is her statement." As the hours passed, the story took on a pulse of its own. Newsrooms scrambled for follow UPS. Who was Jasmine behind the calm? What did this mean for judicial accountability? For women in power? For America's fragile faith in fairness? Talk radio hosts debated whether this was the start of a larger reckoning. At dinner tables and dorm lounges, families replayed her final words like scripture. Somewhere between admiration and analysis, the movement crystallized. Supporters called it the Crockett effect: when truth stands so firmly it becomes contagious. Hashtags multiplied. Chants reached sports arenas and subway musicians who wove her lines into rhythm and rhyme. It wasn't fandom, it was validation, a collective acknowledgement that dignity could still outperform spectacle. By midnight, one network tallied more than 25 million views of the clip across platforms. Another poll claimed that public trust in law and fairness had ticked upward for the first time in months. The impossible had happened: a courtroom confrontation had restored something cynicism had taken away: belief. Even some of Cannon's usual defenders fell silent, their social media feeds conspicuously empty. When power misreads the moment, it loses not by defeat but by invisibility. And as the camera panned over the courthouse the next morning, chalk graffiti glowed on the steps: "Truth doesn't need permission." The city hummed with a different kind of energy, part pride, part reconciliation. It wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's victory anymore. It belonged to anyone who had ever stayed quiet in the face of injustice and finally saw that silence embarrassed only the oppressor. The headline summed it up best: "Justice spoke back." But as the dust settled, one question echoed louder than all the applause: what happens next for both women? By dawn the next morning, the frenzy had softened into quiet reflection. The courthouse looked the same: gray stone, cool air, but something invisible lingered, like the echo of a song no one could stop humming. News trucks rolled away, leaving faint tire marks on wet pavement. Only Jasmine remained for a while longer, standing near the steps where chants had once roared like surf. She didn't smile. She simply looked upward, her breath visible in the morning air. Somewhere beyond the cameras, she thought, was the country still deciding what it believed in: control or conscience, noise or truth. She chose truth long ago. Reporters would later ask how she'd kept her composure. She'd answer, by reminding myself that anger belongs to those who have something to hide. It was sincerity, not performance. Through every interruption, every cutting glare, she had faced one question: who am I in the presence of power? Her answer had been silence, but the kind that speaks louder than sermons. As she replayed the moment in her mind, she saw it differently now. Cannon's bench had never been the real symbol of power. It was the mirror of every institution that mistakes status for substance. The true authority that day arose not from marble floors or oaths but from the clarity of conscience standing before them. Jasmine realized she had not merely argued a case, she had exposed a truth. Integrity, once revealed, destabilizes false authority by simply existing. Viewers who had watched for spectacle found themselves changed. The debate stopped being about personalities or politics. It became a meditation on what justice should feel like. Cannon's gavel, Jasmine's poise, two embodiments of the American paradox. One clung to hierarchy, the other insisted on humanity. And woven between them was the lesson this country keeps relearning: that equality doesn't whisper to power, it holds its gaze until power blinks first. For Jasmine, the aftermath wasn't conquest but confirmation. She carried no triumph, only gratitude. The people who wrote to her, teachers, nurses, immigrants, veterans, didn't thank her for winning, they thanked her for being unafraid to stand still. In their letters, she heard their own small battles echo, speaking up at school board meetings, refusing to be misnamed, demanding fairness even when told to yield. In that resonance lay the revelation. Democracy, she thought, survives through millions of quiet acts of courage. Moments most will never see, lived by people who refuse to confuse politeness with respect. That's what she wanted the showdown to mean, not defiance for its own sake, but the power of calm clarity in a landscape addicted to outrage. She walked down the courthouse steps as the sun rose higher, her heels clicking like punctuation. Across the street, an old man tipped his hat. "Well said, ma'am," he murmured, not needing to explain what he meant. On television, analysts were still dissecting the exchange like scholars over scripture. Some framed it as cultural commentary, a few called it constitutional theater. Jasmine knew better. What happened inside that room was simpler, humbler. One woman asked another to see her plainly, and the second woman could not. The moment's shock came not from rebellion but from recognition. In the days that followed, her words were quoted in campaign speeches, classrooms, even church sermons. "Truth doesn't require permission" became a refrain. But beyond the slogans, something subtler persisted: the rediscovery that composure itself is a form of courage. Because calm, when rooted in conviction, dismantles arrogance more powerfully than anger ever could. Outrage consumes, dignity endures. Jasmine's reflection on that truth turned personal. She thought of her parents' kitchen table, of their insistence that pride meant self-control, not silence. She thought of her law students watching the clip in lecture halls and learning that power doesn't protect the loud, it yields to the clear. The controversy faded, as all controversies eventually do, but its moral residue stayed behind, an invisible reminder that the American promise is only as strong as the people willing to speak it aloud without fear. In every courtroom, every classroom, every household where inequity still lurks, someone would now remember this: you don't need to shout to shake the walls of power. You only need to stand unwavering, in the light of what's right. And yet, what we witnessed wasn't just a political clash, it was a reminder of who we are when we refuse to be silent. The image remains: the courtroom frozen in disbelief, the gavel raised but powerless, Jasmine Crockett's calm reverberating across marble and time. What had looked like silence was, in truth, an awakening, a reminder that dignity still disarms arrogance, that truth still echoes even when authority trembles. In the days after, that single moment became bigger than the confrontation itself. It became a mirror held up to a restless nation, a collective realization that voices can still carve change out of ceremony, that one composed breath can be louder than any shout. The stunned faces in that room could have been any of ours, watching the balance of justice recalibrated before our eyes. Now it belongs to the audience, each person who replayed the clip not as entertainment but as validation. The lesson isn't confined to courtroom walls. Authenticity is strength, composure is power, and silence is never the same as surrender. The courage that held its ground under that spotlight calls for reflection beyond it. So as the scene fades, from the crowd outside to the scrolling headlines, from the chant still humming in the distance to a skyline glowing with early evening light, the voiceover rises one last time. "Remember this feeling," it says. The moment when truth steadied itself against the tide. Share it. Speak it. Be it. Because democracy doesn't survive on noise, it survives on conscience. And conscience, once awakened, cannot be silenced. The screen darkens, replaced by white text pulsing like a heartbeat. Dignity doesn't shout, it endures. Then, one final line appears, a bridge between story and movement. Join the conversation.
Defend the truth.
Keep the courage alive. Fade to black, leaving the echo of composure standing taller than any gavel could.